Before I came up here and became y'all's pastor, I was a computer programmer. I worked for a school district, and one of the jobs I had was making websites. If you ever need a website made, don't ask me to make it. I'm really bad at it. But this was one of the things I did. Luckily, I was assigned to a purely internal department website that no one else needed to look at, so it didn't have to look pretty. It just had to be functional. And I was good at that. I was really good at functional, really bad at pretty. But, there kind of developed two classes of people among those who make websites. There's the folk who actually go in and write the code and it shows up on a website. And then there's the folk that use what are called WYSIWYG editors. WYSIWYG standing for what you see is what you get. The folk who wrote code tended to look strongly down on the folk that used WYSIWYG editors because, well, folk that code tend to look down on anyone that doesn't code. So that's what it is. But a WYSIWYG editor, the way it works is you build a website like you would make a PowerPoint presentation or a Word document. You don't really have to know HTML or PHP or any of the other fancy stuff that is involved. You plug it all into a program and out pops a website. Hence, what you see is what you get. Now, we've probably heard that expression a lot when it comes to different things, but I contend to you that as we go through life, what we see is never what we actually get, because our eyes are liars. And I don't mean that in like some kind of fancy metaphor. I mean, it'll become a fancy metaphor. I'm a pastor, it's what I do. But our eyes actually lie to us because science tells us so. You see, what happens when we see something is light reflects off of an object and it goes into our eyes. And the light goes through our lens, through the cornea, hits the retina, gets transmitted into an electrical signal that goes through the optic nerve into the occipital lobe of our brain, which then gets processed by our visual cortex. That takes about 13 milliseconds from the time the light goes into our eye into the time it's processed to our brain is about 13 milliseconds. Now, interestingly enough, what our brain then does with that is it says, oh, I know that there is a 13 millisecond delay from what I saw to what is actually happening now. So it interprets what everything that was going on is going to be doing 13 milliseconds in the future from when it actually saw it. This is one of the things that makes optical illusions work, by the way, because our brain isn't actually seeing things, it's giving us a picture that it interprets of the light that it saw. Confused yet? Okay, I'm about to make it even better. Because our brain also, in addition to doing this interpretation of 13 milliseconds, it kind of does a 15-second rolling average of the things that we see. If you've ever actually watched your eye up close, like maybe I'm weird, but you kind of go up real close in a mirror and your eye is really twitchy. Have you ever noticed that? Our brain, because of this moving average, one of the things that does is it makes it so that twitchiness that our eye does, we have a smooth picture. I mean, I can walk over here and y'all are not, bouncing up and down. You're there. So our eye does all this. And then, oh, by the way, this 15-second moving average is also why so often you miss typos when you edit something. Because if something is just similar enough to the things around it, your brain just kind of discards that information as not important. So don't blame me when there's a typo on the screen. It's my eye's fault. It's also why we don't notice mistakes in movies, or why we don't notice stunt doubles very often when, Tom Cruise disappears and someone that, when you actually look at them, doesn't look at all like Tom Cruise shows up and gets punched in the face. We just don't notice this because our eyes don't notice small details like that. They can. I mean, if I, pop my hand in front of my face like that, I definitely saw that my hand was there. But in general, it takes an average. So our eyes don't actually tell us what's going on. Now, here's where the metaphor comes in, because I'm a pastor. Everything is a sermon illustration. This whole being a fountain of useless knowledge really comes in handy when I'm preparing these things. Wait, did I just give away a secret pastor secret? Forget I said that. Oh, wait, this is recorded. Disregard. So today's reading from 2 Corinthians is really a continuation of the one we had the week before. You can tell it's a continuation because Paul uses a conjunctive adverb. Now, some of you might not remember what a conjunctive adverb is, but it's a word that combines sentences together, like because, or therefore, like Paul starts this section of 2 Corinthians with. Therefore, yada, 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 yada. Whenever there's a therefore in the Bible, or a because, or a for, or some other word like that, and you come across it, make sure you go back. So like if the lesson for a Sunday, and if you're one of those people that like to read the lessons in advance, and you see the lesson, and you see that it starts out with the word therefore, back up several verses to find out what it is that Paul is thereforeing about. Because anything that starts with therefore becomes an independent clause. So first you get a science lesson about how the eye works, then you get a grammar lessons about conjunctive adverbs. Independent clauses can't stand on their own because they require something in advance. If I just showed up and said, because pews, what am I becausing pews to? Nobody knows. So when Paul just says, therefore, what did he say? Therefore, we do not lose heart. Okay. What might we be losing heart about that Paul is thereforeing? Well, he's thereforeing because we are hard pressed on every side but not crushed, perplexed but not in despair, persecuted but not abandoned, struck down but not destroyed. We carry around in our body the death of Jesus so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our bodies. Therefore, don't lose heart. See, it makes perfect sense when you know what he's thereforeing about, right? Because we know that because when we have Jesus, no matter what's going on around us, things will be okay. We fix our eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen. We live by faith and not by sight. Because right now, as Paul so eloquently puts it, we live in a tent. Now, how many of you have been camping in a tent, like tent camping, not this fancy trailer camping? So a lot of us have been tent camping. If you're in a tent and, say, the wind picks up, not entirely pleasant, right? If you're in a tent and the wind picks up and then all of a sudden you start to hear that glorious pitter-patter on the roof of your tent, no amount of waterproofing makes a tent completely waterproof, right? It's not pleasant. So whenever storms rise up around a tent, you do whatever you can to try to get out of that tent. It's just not the most fun experience. Now, yesterday morning, I was sitting calm and secure in my house. And the wind picked up, and I didn't notice. And the rain picked up, and I didn't notice. And there was a crack of thunder, and that I noticed because the lights went off for about 4 seconds and then they came right back on again. But when something happens and you're in a house, it takes a lot of wind to do something to a house, right? A wind that will roll over a tent isn't going to do much to a house. Rain that will make your life quite unpleasant in a tent won't make your life all that unpleasant in a house. So Paul calls our bodies tents, temporary dwellings. Oddly enough, at the beginning of John's gospel, usually it gets translated as the word became flesh and dwelt among us. The actual word is tented among us. It's just, cute little thing about how that works. So we have a tent, but God is preparing for us a house. And not just any house, but an eternal house. And that's the thing that makes it so that whatever we go through on this earth isn't a huge deal. Because we have this promise from God that there is another life. We have a promise from God that this life with its sin and its sadness and its death and all its junk isn't all there is. The things that we see around us isn't really the whole of reality. Because there is another reality that is to come. A whole new creation where sin and death isn't a problem. And so Paul is reminding us that this life we can manage because of the promise of the next one. This tent we can manage because of the promise of an eternal house. That's what it means when Paul says we walk by faith and not by sight. The things that we see around us, a world with death and attacks and pain and just a lot of ick, that's a world that we know isn't really our home. Because we are not citizens just of this land, we are citizens of God's country. We belong in His place. Right now, we're camping. But God tells us we have a house to go home to. If we lived just by what our eyes told us, we would be just like the blind man that Jesus healed. We would look around and we'd see people, but we wouldn't know the difference between them and trees. But with Jesus and with the Holy Spirit working in our lives, we can see what is really going on, and we can look ahead to the promise that we have. The faith that we have in God is what keeps us steady through the ups and downs of life. And it keeps us focused on Him so that when the time comes for us to go home, we know what our house is going to be like. And we know that we will have God to thank for it. And as a dinner guest. So make sure you keep your house nice and tidy, because if God's coming over, whew. So we walk by faith and not by sight. We trust in the things that God tells us more than we trust in the things that we see around us. Because if we look at the world around us, it's easy to lose heart. It's easy to be frustrated. It's easy to be angry. But we know that we are pressed, but not crushed. We are persecuted, but we're not abandoned. We are struck down, but we're not destroyed. Because why? Because Jesus destroyed the power of sin and death over us. And He claims us for His own. And therefore, we do not lose heart. But instead, we trust in those promises of God and the promise of a world without sin, without death, a world of eternal life.